Well, as Aretha so famously sang, "Who's Zooming Who?" I know who I'm zooming with right now. It is the man of 1,000 voices, Rich Little. Hello, Rich.
Good to be on with you.
You are one of the most famous celebrity impersonators in the world. Is this true? You got your taste for mimicking stars, for celebrity impersonations, when you were working as an usher in a theatre?
I was an usher, yes, for a number of years when I was a teenager, and I was a terrible usher because I kept looking at the movie and people were trying to find their seats and stumbling over each other. And I was watching the movie. I remember I saw the movie Marty, and I remember when I met Ernest Borgnine, I told him that I'd seen Marty at least 40 times. And he said, well, that's interesting. I've only seen it once. I used to remember some of the dialogue, and I used to do it for him. And he'd look at me and say, you know, Rich, I don't even remember that myself, for heaven's sake.
Do you remember who you first impersonated, even if it was only in your mind watching those great classic movies?
The first movie star that I ever imitated was Jimmy Stewart. I can remember after seeing a movie called The Far Country, I sat down at the dinner table and I said to my mom, I want a piece of apple pie.
Back when you were coming through the ranks and kind of starting out, who were those that most influenced you and were most admired by you?
My favorite actor, even to this day, was Gregory Peck. And I remember when I saw him in To Kill a Mockingbird. And I can remember near the end of his life, he was doing a one-man show where people asked him questions and he talked about his career. And I went to see it. And I told him I was coming, so he knew I was in the audience. And then he took questions from the audience. And I stood up and said, does anybody do an impersonation of you, Mr. Peck? And he said, well, there's this fellow Rich Little that does me, but I don't know how good it is. And I said, Rich Little? Oh, I can do it much better than Rich Little. And so I did a speech from one of his movies, and it went over really well. And he said after I finished doing this speech, he said, I think you better come backstage. We're going to have to work on that.
For many years, you were a regular on the Johnny Carson show, and I know that you guest hosted that. How did Johnny take to your really quite searing impersonations? Did he have a good sense of humor about it?
I don't know whether he liked it or not. It depends on what I was saying. But, I remember one time I might have gone too far. I said, the only way to do it good, Johnny Carson, is to make sure that the jokes aren't very good. And I got a look from him, and I wasn't booked back on the show for a couple of months after that. He had a good sense of humor, but Johnny Carson that you saw on TV wasn't the Johnny Carson in real life. In real life, he was very shy and he didn't talk to anybody. If you went to a party where he was there, he kept to himself and he just wasn't very social, but he was fabulous on TV. But he could be difficult. And I remember when he was retiring, he had quit for about a year, and I met him at a restaurant, and he came up to me in the restaurant, even though I was banned from the show for a while, but he came up to me in the restaurant. He said, Richard, are you still doing me in your act? And I said, yes, I am. Well, do they remember me? I said, of course they do, John. My God, they'll remember you forever. And he said, well, I haven't been on TV for about a year. And I was just wondering if you put my voice away somewhere. I said, no, I'm doing you all the time. I'll be damned. I can't believe that.
When you seemingly offended him and he kind of banished you from the show for a while, did that upset you, Rich?
Yes, it did, because I couldn't understand why. I don't know what the problem was, but I was suddenly a no book on the show. I had been on it 60 times, and I hosted the show 32 times. And so it was a big part of my life doing the Carson show. But I had a falling out with somebody. It could have been anybody, I don't know. But I never really found out why. But I ended up being a no book on the show.
In terms of hitting the big time in the US, really, I suppose you could attribute that to the late, great Judy Garland, the Judy Garland show. Was it Mel Torme who kind of got you two together?
Yes, it was Mel Torme who got me on the Judy Garland show. We had done a variety show in Toronto, and we got to be great friends. And so he said, I'm going to be working on the upcoming Judy Garland show. I'm going to be doing special material for her. And I'm going to pitch you for being on the show. And I said, you are? He said, yeah, let's put a lot of your voices on a tape, and then I'll take it over to Judy and play her the tape, and I'm sure you'll get on the show. So I did. I put on about 20 or 30 impressions on this tape. And when he got back to Hollywood, he went over to Judy's house, and he was going to play the tape for her. And she said, don't bother. And he said, why not? She said, I don't like impersonators. They make me fart. Do you believe she said that? But anyway, he said, well, just listen to a couple of them. And she wasn't interested at all. But once she heard my impression of James Mason, when I did James Mason on the tape, that's when she said, book him. That's terrific. What a James Mason. I love James Mason. Book him on the show. And I remember running into James Mason after I did the show at some event. And I went up to him and I said, Mr. Mason, you don't know who I am, but I want to thank you for getting me on the Judy Garland show. And he looked at me and he said, what on earth are you talking about? Out of my way. And he just disappeared.
What was the real Judy Garland like? Rich, the Judy Garland, obviously, you got to see and got to know for that time that you were a regular on her show.
Well, I was in my early 20s, and this was my first television show in the States, the Judy Garland show, and nothing like starting at the top, right? And I didn't know about all her problems, which I found out about later. She never came out of the dressing room. They couldn't get her on the set. She'd been drinking. She got panicky, and there were all kinds of problems going on. And I wasn't aware of all this. And they kept saying to me, oh, there's technical problems. That's why she hasn't shown up. They finally got Judy out of her dressing room. She came on the set. This was about 2:00 in the morning. We taped the show. And the reason that my routine went over so well was that she'd never come to rehearsal. And she'd never seen me do my routine before, which is unusual for somebody that's hosting a show. But her reaction to me was incredible because she'd never seen me do it before. And if you watch it today, you can't take your eyes off her. You don't even look at me. You're looking at her reaction, which is incredible, especially at the end when I did my James Mason. That's when she went, oh my God, that's incredible. And so that really made me on the Judy Garland show was Judy's reaction.
Tell me, did you make a fart?
No, I don't think I did. But I can remember one incident on the Judy Garland show was that my manager took my suit a couple of blocks away from the studio to get it pressed. And on his way back, the trousers fell out of off the hanger on the street. And so when he hung my suit up and they said, get ready, the show's going to start in about 20 minutes, I had no trousers. And I thought, how can I do the Judy Garland show with no pants? And so they got an usher. And told him to take his trousers off. And then I wore the usher's trousers on the Judy Garland show, but they were a little short. And so they were told, the cameraman, not to shoot me too low, not full frame.
Oh, that's incredible.
But she was very nice to me. She was extremely nice to me. She had a wonderful sense of humor, very insecure, and took a lot of pills, we know that, and a lot of liquor. But when she was performing, she was magical. I mean, she just was incredible. And she treated me very well. And I must say that I have some great memories about doing that show. Yeah, I never saw her, though, after I did the show. And as a matter of fact, I do a little of her in my act. The night is bitter, the stars have lost their glitter. You know, it's that little quakiness that you get in her voice that makes her voice.
Your impressions of US presidents are obviously legendary. Is this right? You're impersonating Richard Nixon right in front of Richard Nixon.
Right.
And he wondered why in heck you were speaking in such a funny voice.
Early in my career, I was just in my 20s, but I'd done a lot of television, so I was fairly well known. And I was invited to a garden party in San Clemente for Richard Nixon. And I went, and I was thrilled because I got to meet my act. They were all there. There was Jack Benny there, George Burns there, Glenn Ford there, Glenn Campbell, Debbie Reynolds. They were all there. And Debbie Reynolds grabbed me by the arm, pulled me around the swimming pool, flung me at the back of Richard Nixon, and yelled out in a loud voice, "Mr. President, Rich is going to do you." And he thought maybe that meant I was going to shoot him. So he turned around and stared at me, and I didn't know what to do. And everybody gathered around, and I started to do my impression of Richard Nixon for him. And halfway through doing my little routine, he turned to his wife, Pat, and said, "Why is this young man speaking in this strange voice?" And Pat said, "He's doing you, honey." And he said, "Well, I didn't know I had a voice." No, well, Richard Nixon was kind of square. He didn't have much of a sense of humor, you know.
Of all the US presidents you've done, as you say, who's your favorite?
Oh, Ronald Reagan, definitely. I got to know Reagan very well.
Yes.
And I performed at the White House many times. I went up to their private quarters to have a meal. I've had tea up there, and they couldn't have been nicer to me because Reagan had a wonderful sense of humor. He was incredible. I mean, every time I met him, he wanted me to tell him a joke, you know. And one time, Ronald Reagan did some impressions for me. I said, "You do some impressions, Mr. President?" "Well, yes, but not as well as you do. But I do a pretty fair Jimmy Stewart and not bad John Wayne. And my favorite that I do is Truman Capote." And I said, "What?" He said, I do Truman Capote. And I said, "Oh my gosh, really? But unfortunately, Rich, I don't know what to say. I don't have a joke." So I gave him one. I said to him, "Well, you can have a joke that I use when I do Truman Capote." And he said, "Well, I don't want to steal your material." I said, No, Mr. President, please." So he got a Secret Service man and he wrote the joke on his back. And he said to me, "What is it?" And I said, "Well, the joke is this. This is Truman Capote. And, you know, I wrote in cold blood, you know, but actually that's not true. Actually, I wrote in ink." And Reagan thought that was hysterical. He wrote that down on the back of a Secret Service man. And he said to me, after putting it in his pocket, "Do you believe this?" He said to me as he put the joke in his pocket, he said, I can't wait to try that out on Gorbachev." Now, I thought to myself later, I would love to see that. Can you imagine President of the United States doing Truman Capote for Gorbachev? I mean, I would give a year's salary to see that, you know.
There is a great, rich little Ronald Reagan story I love. Apparently, you're at the White House, off to lunch, and the president is in the middle of giving a press conference, and you finish it off for him.
That's right. I was invited to a luncheon at the White House, and I was supposed to be there at 11 o'clock for a 12 o'clock luncheon, and I got hung up on traffic, and I was late, and I was frantic. And I remember running down the corridor to the Lincoln room where the tea was, or the luncheon was, and Reagan was giving a press conference out in front of the Lincoln room. And he looked up at me and said, "Rich, thank God you're here, because you do me better than I do. So you finish this damn press conference." And then he split. And I was in front of the press and they were asking me questions like they were still talking to Reagan, you know?
You know, you look at Ronald Reagan, he did have the most magical marriage, didn't he, to Nancy?
Oh,
Theirs
yes.
was something quite special.
They really loved each other very, very much. And I liked Nancy. She was very nice to me too. One time at the White House, I played Santa Claus. Every year they had a celebrity dress up as Santa Claus and give presents to the little kids. And I remember Nancy showed up and I was dressed up in Santa Claus with the beard and everything. And she looked over at me and said, "Who have we got playing Santa Claus this year?" And she took my beard and she pulled it down. It was on an elastic. And she went, "Rich Little." And then she let it go and damn near took my nose off.
Tell me about this. You, Ronald Reagan, were told to F off by Bette Davis, apparently.
I was invited to Ronald Reagan's first inauguration, and Patricia Neal was there, and Elizabeth Taylor was there, and Tom Selleck was there. And then after the ceremony, we went back to the Watergate Hotel of all hotels, where Pat Neal was staying, to hang around there and have some drinks and some sandwiches, and then go to the first inauguration ball. And at one point, Elizabeth Taylor said, "Where's Bette Davis? She should be here." And Tom Selleck said, "Well, I heard she was coming, but nobody saw her." And so my PR guy said, "Let's phone her up and find out what happened, why she didn't make it." And then somebody said, I think it was Tom Selleck, said, "Why don't we phone up Bette Davis as Jimmy Stewart?"
Yeah.
Well, before I could say anything more, they dialed the number and handed me the phone. And I said, "This is Jimmy Stewart." And she went, "Oh, Jimmy, I'm so glad you phoned me. Oh, I miss you so much. Well, we're just wondering what happened to you today. We didn't see you at the inauguration." And she said, "Oh, Jimmy, I wanted to be there, but I didn't feel well, so I didn't come. Oh, listen, while I've got you on the phone, let's discuss our plans for the summer. Are you coming up to see me with the children, or are you coming up with just Gloria?" And I thought, oh, I'm really over my head now. So I said into the phone, "Miss Davis, this is not Jimmy Stewart. It's Rich Little, and everybody here wanted me to phone you up as Jimmy Stewart." And she went, "That's not funny. That is disgusting that you would do that to me, thinking I was talking to Jimmy Stewart." And she hung up, and she was furious. Well, we now go over to the first inauguration ball, and as soon as we walk in, we see Jimmy Stewart and the president. And so Elizabeth Taylor tells him what happened with me phoning up Bette Davis as Jimmy Stewart. And Reagan said, "Well, I bet she got a big kick out of that." And everybody said, "No, she was furious at Rich and hung up, and she was not pleased." And Reagan said, "Well, that doesn't sound like her. I made a couple of movies with her, and I always thought she had a great sense of humor. So let's phone her up and I'll straighten this out for you." And we said, "What?" He said, "Let's get her on the phone." So we walked down to a little room somewhere, and he got on the phone, and he said, what's her number?" And I remember Tom Selleck gave him the number, and he dialed it, and Bette Davis answered and said, "Hello." And Reagan said, "Bet, this is President Reagan calling." "Go to hell, Rich Little." And she slammed the whole phone down. And that isn't exactly what she said. She used the F word, which I wasn't going to use.
You know, Rich, from Jack Nicholson to Cary Grant, you name it, you've done them all, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. Is there anybody who's taken offense at your impersonations?
Paul Lynde. he hated my impression. Every time I did him on Hollywood Squares or on the Dean Martin roast, he got very upset. He kept saying, "Who's he doing? Who's that? That's disgusting. Get a day job." And he just hated it. And every time I did him on Hollywood Squares, they would pan to him for a reaction, and he'd make a face. And he just didn't like it at all. He hated it, and I could never figure out why. On Hollywood Squares, he was hysterical. You know, some of his material was a little raunchy, but I heard later that the censors didn't bleep him because they were laughing so hard.
You know, here's the thing, Rich. You think of the great people you've done over the decades, you know, from Humphrey Bogart to Jimmy Stewart, Cary Grant. They all had this incredible uniqueness of voice and style and mannerism that allowed you to capture them so impeccably. But when you look at the stars of today, am I right in thinking it's very hard to capture that spirit because there's kind of like no thing, the likes of which Bogart had, or Frank Sinatra, or Dean Martin, or whoever?
Well, they were larger than life, and they were always the same. Actors today take different parts.
Yes.
So, you know, you could say, do you do Dustin Hoffman? Do you do him as Tootsie, or do you do him and Rain Man, or what? You know, I mean, they were different in different movies. And the actors of the 40s and 50s, as I said, were larger than life, and they were always the same, and they had very distinctive voices. But the actors today, and there's a lot of good ones today, but they don't have voices like they used to.
That's right. You referenced those Dean Martin roasts, the fabulous TV specials, and you were roaster, I think, in 24, 25 of them. Yeah. Who was your favorite to roast and toast? Was there one celebrity that stood out?
Well, I think the roast we did to Jimmy Stewart was my favorite, because the idea that somebody came up with was classic. I was going to tell Jimmy Stewart that he didn't sound like Jimmy Stewart anymore, and I was going to show him how to do Jimmy Stewart. So I got him up and said, "Let me hear your Jimmy Stewart." And he started talking, and I said, "That doesn't sound like Jimmy Stewart." And then I started to show him how to do Jimmy Stewart, and he said, I guess I just don't sound like I used to. Rich, I used to talk fast in movies, but as the years went by, I got slower and slower and slower. And finally today, I just don't talk at all.
You're a fabulous actor as well. I remember you as Brother Paul, that kind of, you know, clumsy monk in The Flying Nun.
Yeah, Brother Paul. He was an accident-prone priest.
Yes.
A little bit like Clouseau, you know. And I did a couple of those shows as Brother Paul, and they talked about making it into a series, but it never happened. But that was a fun part for me, you know. And I also, you know, even though I was known as an impersonator and basically a comedian, I was very lucky to play murderers and a few very dramatic parts in Policewoman and Hawaii Five-0 and a couple of Mannix, where I played a character, not Rich Little.
Yeah,
and that was great for me, because that brought me back to when I was a teenager, being an actor, you know. And I've always wanted to be an actor, and then I got into impersonations because I thought it was a quicker way to success.
You've done the voices for some absolute legends who fell ill. I mean, in David Niven's voice in The Trail of the Pink Panther, and I think the other one was The Curse of the Pink Panther.
Right, that's right.
What was that like?
I did a lot of that, actually. I haven't lately, but at one point I was doing a lot of dubbing for people either who lost their voice, like David Niven did, or people that had passed away and they needed some dialogue and they didn't have it. So I ended up doing Clouseau. I did Peter Sellers for a couple of movies, and I did David Niven for, as you said, The Curse of the Pink Panther and Trail of the Pink Panther. I also did Gene Kelly for a Christmas special, and he had lost his voice completely, and I dubbed the whole half hour as Gene Kelly, and I did the whole show because Gene Kelly had that kind of high voice where he talked like this, and I can remember doing this, and they said to me, well, if you do this for us, we don't want it to get out. So everybody thought it was really him, and it was
Gene
me.
Kelly.
I dubbed for Tony Curtis too in a movie he walked off on. He was making an epic in Italy, swashbuckling kind of movie, and they didn't pay him, and he just walked off the movie and went back to the States. And they phoned me and wanted me to dub some lines for Tony Curtis, and I did them. You know, I did the voice of Tony for this movie that he never finished. And I remember phoning up Tony and telling him that I did this, and he said to me, "Did they pay you?" And I said, "Yes, they did pay me, Tony." And he said, "Good, you owe me half of it."
Wow.
I did Stacey Keach
Yes.
for a couple of Mike Hammers. I did his voice.
Right.
He was in the Slammer, I think, in England at the time, and they needed his voice. And so I worked at it for a long time because I really couldn't do it. So I did it like one line at a time. But I did Stacey Keach for a movie.
You have a fabulous book out. It's titled People I've Known and Been. Tell me about putting this book together. It must have been a labor of love, so many incredible memories.
Well, it's not a biography at all, although I do talk about my childhood a bit in the book, but it's mostly the people I have met and funny things that happened, like the Ronald Reagan story with Bette Davis. And I talk about, so many people that I worked with: Dean Martin, George Burns, Johnny Carson, Orson Welles. And I think it's a pretty good book. I really do. But I do think that it's probably aimed at people of my age group or slightly younger, because there's an awful lot of younger people out there who don't know all these people, you know. And I'm performing at the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas. I've been there for 6 years, and I do a show 4 nights a week, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And once in a while we get young people coming in, but mostly older people that know all the people that I imitated. And the other night, sitting right in front of me, there was a young kid about 15 years old. And I thought to myself as I started my show, he's not going to know anybody I'm impersonating. I don't think he'll know anybody. Maybe he'll know Biden, you know, maybe he'll know Dr. Phil, but I don't think he's going to know more than 1 or 2 voices. Well, anyway, as I did the show, this kid was laughing. I mean, screaming with laughter. And I couldn't figure it out because I knew he didn't know who I was doing. So when the show was over, I called him over and I said, "You seem to enjoy my show." And he said, "Oh, Mr. Little, you were so funny, but I was confused." And I said, "You were confused about what?" He said, "Well, as I watched you, I wondered why you kept changing your voice."
Oh my gosh. Of all of the people you've met and been, is there one that absolutely blew you away just by being so nice and gracious and generous and fabulous?
Don Rickles was great.
Yes.
You know, I think he was the funniest man that ever lived. But, you know, John Wayne was great. I got to know him slightly. And one time he was working on a show called Laugh In, and they had him in a bunny costume. And I showed up on the set. I'd never met him before. And I stood way in the background watching him do his sketch with Dan Martin and Dick. And then I thought, I guess I've been here long enough. So I just started to leave. And John Wayne went, "Hold on, Little, get the hell over here." And I said, "Oh my God, what's this?" So I walked over to Duke. He said, "I understand you do a pretty good impression of me, and you do my walk." I said, "Yeah." "All right, let me see it. I want you to do my walk for me. So everybody moved back, and I did John Wayne's walk right across the set. And I did it pretty good, actually. And I came back, and he looked at me and he said, well, I'll be damned. I've been walking like Loretta Young for 50 years.
So, Rich Little, in your entire career, has there ever been one absolute standout pinch yourself moment?
When I met James Cagney, Edward G. Robinson, Frank McHugh, and David Huddleston at a luncheon at, I think, David Huddleston's place in Malibu. And I walked in and I saw all those people, and I just couldn't believe it, you know, to see James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson at the same place. And they knew who I was. And that was a big thrill too, you know. So that was a great moment for me. I remember doing Edward G. Robinson for him. I did Edward G. Robinson for him. And it was later in his life, and he couldn't hear. He was almost deaf. So I did my Edward G. Robinson for him. Walter, the first thing I noticed in that Dieterson case was the suicide angle, you know, and I did the whole speech from Double Indemnity, and he looked up at me and he went like that. And I realized he didn't hear a damn thing I said, nothing. And he said it was perfect, and he heard nothing.
Rich Little, I could talk to you absolutely forever, and that's a fact. You are fabulous. You are genuinely funny and so incredibly clever and talented. Impersonations are not easy to do, and you nail each and every one of them with precision.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate that.